In November of 1978, a mass catastrophe would happen. The lives of over 900 men, women, and children were taken due to the belief of a mass manipulator. A person who wore a mask over the monster that he really was. A person who gave the promise of paradise, who gave the promise of family, of brotherhood, of belonging, who showed to the world a mask of kindness, a mask of compassion, a mask of hospitality. Yet, the person he really wasn't that. Though he did good deeds, the reason behind those good deeds was something far more sinister. I read so far into this, honestly, more than I ever really wanted to know. But with that said, I really recommend you look into these things yourselves. Don't just go off of what people say. Do your own research. Come to your own conclusions. And see where you end up. But yeah, in a lot of those stories, it seemed to tell the tale of somebody who did all these good things, but then kind of went crazy later in life because they got drunk on power. Yet, when I looked into it, that didn't really seem to be the case. It seems that this evil laid beneath that mask for a very long time, going all the way back to childhood. And today, that's what we're going to be talking about. This is the first episode in a multiple-part series that I'm going to be doing. And this first episode is going to go into the early life of Jim Jones, before Guyana. And you may be wondering, well, why is she doing a story on something that happened over in South America? Well, a majority of the life of his congregation actually existed over in Redwood Valley, a place that lies only 15 minutes away from the Lake County border. The place in Redwood Valley actually happened to be the place that he would bring people after recruiting them from places like San Francisco and other areas. It was rural. There wasn't a lot of eyes on it. Exactly what he needed to do what he wished behind those walls. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Cheyenne Blue. And up until now, my channel is focused on stories, people, history tied to Lake County. This is one of those first stories that I'm kind of stepping out of just doing Lake County. Now, that's not to say that I'm not going to do Lake County stories anymore, but there's a lot of stories that tie in with Lake County. But there's also stories that I've been wanting to do beyond Lake County. And I'm really excited to bring those to you as well. As I'm telling this story, you'll probably find yourself wondering, how is it that he got away with everything that he did? Well, it's a situation you don't fully understand until you've been in it yourself. Because the most terrifying villains in movies, in stories, the ones that shake us to our core, aren't the ones that are outwardly straight up seeming to be the villains that you know right away. It's the ones that gain your trust, the ones that seem kind, the ones that seem to have the biggest hearts. And then, right when they get you where they want you, it's like a rug gets swept out from under your feet. And that is the biggest monster. That is the most terrifying of them all. And that was the kind of evil that Jim Jones was. James Warren Jones was born during the Great Depression, May 13th of 1931, to James Thurman Jones and Lynetta Putnam. He was their only child. First, I'm going to start with Jim Jones's mother, Lynetta. She was said to be a strong woman, but a cold woman, with not a maternal bone in her body. She was the eldest daughter in her family, and she was not focused on having kids whatsoever. She was more focused on her education and her career. She wanted to be kind of a pioneer for her days for women in business. It was said that she picked up this taste for life from her father's own foster father, Lewis Parker, who then became kind of a foster father to her after her father died. Lynetta admired him for the way of his blending business with heart, yet later when he financially failed, she actually kind of blamed it on him having too much of a heart. Yet she still wished to be like him. She looked up to him. She attended the Jonesboro Agricultural College for 2 years, dropped out, and then went to the business college in Evansville, Indiana for another 2 years. And then Lynetta's mom died of typhoid fever in 1925. And it was at this time that Lynetta's idea for having a family, or not having a family, I should say, shifted. It was at this time she decided that she would have but one child, a son, one like Lewis Parker. She made this decision long before meeting Jim Jones's father, James Thurman Jones. Several years after making that wish to herself, she would become pregnant and have Jim Jones. Now, Jim Jones wasn't anything like what she had imagined. He did have brown eyes like Lewis Parker did, but everything else about him was different. He had olive skin, a round face, slanted eyes, and jet black hair. From what I read, he was of Irish and Welsh descent, and then his mother also claimed Cherokee. But from what I could look up, there's no formal documentation of this, and it was stated that Lynetta's sister said they were just the same as everyone else, and Lynetta was lying about that part, but, I mean, who knows? Now, I didn't get to talk much yet about James Thurman Jones. Now, James, he came from a family of Quakers, and they had a reputation of being very intelligent and decent people. They had one kind of black sheep family member that did jump off a bridge, but besides that, everyone else did pretty well for themselves. And Jim's father, he was known as a good man before his life took a really sad turn. See, he was a construction foreman before he was shipped off to France in World War I, where during his service there, he would end up getting in a bunch of mustard gas, which would permanently scar his lungs for the rest of his life. Then when he got back, he didn't have an education and anything else to where he could get a desk job or anything. And this was also during a time of hard labor work. So he would collect his government checks. Then when his lungs would allow him to, he would still go out and work on the construction crews and work those hard labor jobs basically until his body would give out. Then once he would get better, he would get back up and repeat the cycle. He was also 16 years older than Lynetta, and apparently a KKK member. But I couldn't find like a whole lot of information on that, but apparently a bunch of people in that area were at that time. So I thought that was kind of interesting considering the way that Jim Jones's trajectory would go over time. Their together was definitely very interesting. After the war, James Thurman Jones became a very dark, gray, brooding man. Reading the way that he was, it seems like it would be safe to assume that the man was dealing with some very severe depression. But back then, depression wasn't really recognized all that much. Which there was a study that I found where mustard gas victims ended up having psychological problems later down the line, including issues with depression and a slew of other things. Which, I mean, it makes sense. You're struggling to breathe and your life ends up just kind of turning upside down. You end up having this disability. Yeah, it makes sense why the guy would be depressed. Now, in contrast, though I said that Lynetta was cold, she was also a very fiery person, and she was always kind of like bing, bing, bing all over the place doing one thing or another. In those days, she definitely did not cater to anything that was considered ladylike. She would often have a hand-rolled cigarette and was no stranger to a cold one after work. Pretty much never saw her wearing a dress, but granted, because she ended up having to be the breadwinner for her family, she didn't even have time to throw on a dress. It was always pretty much just work clothes. She wasn't the only working mother in town, but she was definitely one that stood out quite a bit, and it wasn't just due to her masculineness. It was also because she was down to earth, extremely educated, very independent in her ideas, ambitious, frugal, and eccentric. She described herself too as a humanitarian. In fact, she was so well educated that her education far surpassed most men that lived in their little town of Guinn. However, because of the location that she was in, the time period, and their circumstances, unfortunately, she was held back quite a bit due to that. Despite having to work so much, though, she would find the time to dream, to write, to read, and what was really important to her was making sure that all of this passed on to her son. The time that she did have, she would make sure that he was fed and did everything she could to make sure that he was successful in the real world. See, she didn't want life to be disappointing for her son. She literally scraped every last penny that she could and would save aside for his college fund. That way he could pursue his dreams when he grew up. Though it seems that her heart was in the right place on a lot of these things, unfortunately that also meant that Jim was left without a mother during his formative years. She was always having to work, and he would be left in the care of others or by himself, since his mom would have to jump on the bus over to Richmond first thing in the morning. I do think she intended to leave him with his dad, but then his dad would end up going to the card room that was back where they lived, which is basically like this poker bar type thing. And he would go play cards, he would play pool and things along that line, and just really was absent for his son mentally. Then when he would come home, he would just collapse into his rocking chair and listen to the radio just slowly rocking back and forth. Lynetta would come home, she would feed everyone, and help Jim with whatever studies that he had that night. Jim developed early in a lot of ways throughout his life. I think a lot of it had to do with how much he was on his own, survival. And one of the first ways that he developed early was learning how to walk on his own by using a little red cart in place of his parents' hands. One day, as Jim was pushing along his little cart, he found himself over by the railroad tracks. Now, he was just a little guy and he didn't really understand the dangers of trains, and was pushing along his little cart, got a little too close to the railroad, and the train swiped his cart. Luckily, and it ended up not hurting him, but it did bust up his cart and he no longer had a cart anymore. His neighbor, Myrtle Kennedy, saw the whole fiasco, and she believed that this was an act of God protecting the little boy. She took it upon herself to start watching over him, cleaned him up, and would take him into her home whenever she would see him. Myrtle would make a lot of comments about Jim Jones's mother, saying that she couldn't believe how neglectful that Lynetta was. But really, I don't think she could fully conceptualize the position that they were in and the fact that Lynetta really was just doing whatever she could to keep the family afloat. But at the same time, I do get it. Jim realized at a pretty young age that he was definitely different. He noticed that the things other kids had, he didn't, particularly with his parents. His mother was rarely around to care for him, and his father didn't really work. They didn't attend church together or sleep in the same bed, and his heart yearned for something that he just couldn't have. To ease his loneliness, he ended up collecting stray dogs. And for some reason, this little boy, the animals just seemed to flock to him, and next thing you know, he had a whole little entourage following him around the town. Besides that, he also did have the neighbor that I mentioned earlier, Myrtle Kennedy, which he would definitely attribute her to being a huge light in his life growing up. Myrtle said that she saw under the dirt and grime a little sweet, smart, affectionate boy that needed love and guidance. She wished to save him in what ways she could, spiritually and however else that she could lend a hand. Myrtle would be the one to introduce Jim Jones to religion. She took him with her and her husband over to her church where he would attend Sunday school. Now, Lynetta, she didn't mind Jim Jones participating in this at all. She actually appreciated Myrtle for helping her out with him. And over time, the two of them actually became quite fond of each other, even though Myrtle would still make her comments and did not really agree with some of the ways that Lynetta lived, but they were still friends. At the age of 4, Jim found friendship in another little boy who lived nearby, Donald Foreman. And this little boy would be a really big part of Jim's life. The boys would wander around together, and they would often stop by this car shop where they would put on a little show. Well, primarily Jim would put on a little show for the workers there in exchange for coins so they could buy soda. Jim had this whole routine where he would basically curse up a storm until the guys were laughing so much that they were in tears. They actually did this a few times a week, and the car guys thought it was great, and they would continue to encourage the behavior. Soon the boys started going to school together. They actually were both pretty good students, both receiving B's in a fairly tough grading system. Jim just had some discipline problems, but it was mainly just minor stuff like talking in class. This behavior improved, though, when he fell in love with reading. By the 3rd or 4th grade, he spent pretty much all of his time at the library and was reading at a 7th and 8th grade level. He loved reading so much that he would actually take several books home with him almost every night, lugging them over his shoulder and carrying them all the way home. Well, he was pretty much a loner, and an unusual one at that, because he seemed very confident in himself and was very outspoken, sure of his ideas, but he just could not blend in for multiple reasons, which, yeah, included his personality. But then he also developed this weird sense of hypervigilance when it came to his hygiene. He would always carry a comb in his pocket, constantly combing his hair to make sure that every hair was in the right place. His clothes were always impeccably cleaned and pressed, which he did on his own. He'd avoid anything that would cause him to get dirty, sweaty, anything like that. He hated physical activity. He'd rather just sit and be lost in his books. Other kids didn't understand this kind of behavior since everybody else would be playing on the playground and Jim would be wherever just reading his books. This led to bullying. But see, Jim, he was actually pretty good at standing up for himself. He would shout out a storm. It took quite a bit to get him to get to the point where he would do anything physical, which, like I said, he really did not like doing anything that would get him roughed up. But just his presence a lot of the times was enough for the bullies to back off and leave him alone. This is where things start to get a little bit weird. Jim, instead of being concerned or appalled by the bullying, he was actually fascinated by it. Anytime there was a fight at the school, you would find Jim Jones watching, observing. He did this so much, in fact, that at one point, a lot of the teachers assumed that he was provoking these fights just to watch them. Outside of school, though, outside the school, he had control over the kids. He learned at an early age how to attract others, how to keep them entertained, and how to hold on to them. Jim, Don, and a handful of other children were drawn to the Jones home. In the back of the Jones property, there was this barn that had a bunch of wire enclosures. And Jim kept an assortment of different animals, from rabbits to chickens to goats, all kinds of creatures. Which, when you're a kid, that's pretty fun. And that's something that attracted a lot of the kids. Jim would spend hours talking to his animals, training them, playing with them. But remember how I said that he hated getting dirty? He would actually have the other kids do the dirty work, to clean up after the animals, to feed the animals, and things along that line. He convinced the other kids that this was a form of play, that it was a challenge, in order for them to do the work that he didn't want to do. Don didn't understand why it was that Jim would have these animals if he didn't like taking care of them. Their pens lacked shade, grass, and open space, and overall it seemed inhumane. When Don asks why he had them, Jim responded, "I just want them." Don tried to convince Jim to give the animals better enclosures and make the area overall more comfortable for them, but Jim simply refused. At this point, the animals that were once a source for him to end his loneliness simply became a lure for others, and nothing more to him. Jim Jones would state in his adulthood, and I quote, "I was ready to kill by the end of 3rd grade. I was so aggressive and so hostile, I was ready to kill. That nobody gave him any love, any understanding. In those days, a parent was supposed to go with a child to school functions. There was some kind of school performance. Everybody's parent was there but mine. I'm just standing there, alone. Always alone." Jim's mother's bitterness towards his father was pretty apparent. Or maybe it was just her own internalized feelings of not being as far ahead in life as she had planned to be. Either way, she would often tell him from a very young age, "Don't be nothing like your dad. You have to make something in your life and be somebody." While most other children worship their parents, Jim already worshiped the church. He flocked there because it was a place where he felt embraced. After going with the Kennedys for quite a while to their church, he started drifting to different churches to see what they were all about. He would pay attention to each one and note what the differences were. Jim found himself captivated by the Gospel Tabernacle, a Pentecostal church with members that called themselves the Holy Rollers. This church had services where there were these crazy high-energy spiritual healings and people that spoke in tongues. When Myrtle found out that Jim was going to this church, lady was clutching her pearl. She's like, "Oh my God, they got a hold of him." Lynetta became concerned when she found out that Jim was being groomed by the woman minister in order to become a child evangelist. She would invite Jim over to her farm to play with the animals as she would talk to him about the Lord, and he would bring her flowers when she was sick. She noticed that he already had a gift of speech, and she felt that with his looks and the way that he could talk, that he would be a real crowd pleaser for the church. Lynetta was not pleased since she felt that they were just trying to make $1 off of her son, but nonetheless, she still tried to give Jim the option to figure things out for himself and carve out his own path. That was until Jim started having horrible night terrors. Lynetta called up the doctor about the night terrors because they just got to this point they were so severe, and the doctor really didn't do much to help. But she noticed that the timing of it had to do something with the church. So she finally took her invitation to go check out the church and see what it was all about. After seeing the services for herself, she was distressed. And the minister ended up coming out to visit Lynetta, and Lynetta kicked the minister out. She would no longer allow Jim to step foot in that church. And in doing so, Jim's night terrors improved. His interest in religion, though, did not waver. Lynetta found Jim preaching to the other children behind a small altar. The ministry definitely wasn't what she had in mind for her son, but she got a kick out of seeing him speak to the town's social elite kids. She also did notice how he would use his booming voice and piercing eyes to order the other children around. But to her, it was better for him to be a leader than it was a servant. In the barn, Jim Jones ended up turning the loft into his own sandbox of whatever he wanted it to be that day. That was his place. That was his sanctuary. One day it would be a lab. One day it would be a church. One day it'd be a carnival. And on another day, it would be a classroom. People were only allowed there on his terms. He would keep the kids there for hours, captivating them in ways that most teachers wish that they could. His presence kept them hooked. He would read school books, books borrowed from the library, and of course, stories from the Bible. Though he would write things down on his notes, he never actually used those notes while he was speaking. He was also the only one that would do these speeches in front of the kids, and the kids even allowed him to scold them. See, they felt like he did a lot of the work for them when it came to schooling and such, because he would read it and interpret it in a way that they could easily comprehend. And a lot of times, he would even help them out with their homework. Some of the kids would brave it through these icy snowstorms to make it to Jim's loft. And then during the summer, Jim would make them lemonade and punch in order to help keep them cool when the loft was boiling hot up there. The kids would become so consumed by his sessions that a lot of the times the parents would have to come and fetch their children after dark. Sometimes he would hold funerals for the animals that had passed on. After everybody had sat down quietly, he would put out all the candles except for one that laid on the altar. He'd take the body of the deceased, wrap it up in cloth, put it in either cardboard or a wooden box, and anoint the cloth with special oil. He'd then carry on with the funeral just like any other preacher would carry on a funeral, which a lot of the kids found pretty unsettling. But because of all the other cool stuff that Jim was doing, they kept coming back. Some of this cool stuff that he did included a sort of science aspect to it. See, Jim's parents gifted him a children's medical kit. This medical kit included a microscope. And Jim, he was so fascinated with the world of medicine and science, he put on full science shows, which would include the microscope with a little slide with whatever Jim had on it that day, from bugs to blood to really anything that piqued his interest. He would set it up on the table and align the microscope just right for the kids to view through it, but nobody was allowed to touch the microscope except for him. Warning, this is a part that gets real weird real quick, and if you have any issues when it comes to animals and animal cruelty, please just fast forward through this. So, as I said, one of the things that he would use on the microscope was blood. And to obtain the blood, he would use a knife to cut his animals to then put the blood on the slides. He claimed that this practice wasn't cruel as it was for science. He also attempted to see what would happen if you would transfuse blood between different species and tried to graft a leg of a chicken onto a duck. Yeah, with a string. And it failed horribly. That poor duck. Another thing that was really, really disturbing is the code that he had for kids to get into the loft was Heil Hitler. Yeah. I told you, this guy was a very disturbed individual from the time he was a kid. And I was not joking. And then we wonder how he ended up where he ended up. And I'm still going. This is still just the beginning. Anyway, continuing on, he found joy in terrorizing the other kids by telling them macabre stories and making them believe in his mysterious powers. Then he would laugh maniacally in this high-pitched cackle. As kind of like a punishment, I guess, he would also lock the kids up in the loft. There was one instance where he locked his best friend Dawn and another kid up in the loft, and the boys, they were banging on the window, asking to be let out, and Jim's just standing there looking up at them, smiling, right? Well, as they continue to bang on the window, his smile gets bigger. And then he turns around and walks away, leaving the boys trapped upstairs. After that particular instance, Dawn's mother discouraged Dawn from really spending so much time with Jim, but didn't really push the subject because of how long the two of them had been friends. And, Jim, he seemed like a really good kid with a good heart. Dawn's mom knew that Jim would often help with the homeless, gathering them food along with his mom, Lynetta, so, he can't be that bad of a kid. Maybe it's because, he's just being a boy, and once again, his so-called compassion and empathy overshined his evil tendencies. Because of the good things that he would do, people would look the other way even when he was a kid because of that. Another example of this actually happens to be straight from a neighbor's mouth that was in an old book that I came across. And that excerpt reads, "When Jones was a boy, he preached a good sermon. I remember working about 200 feet from the Jones place. He would have about 10 youngsters in there, and he would put them through their paces. Line them up and make them march. He'd hit them with a stick until they would scream and cry. I used to say, what's wrong with those kids putting up with it? But they would come back to play with him the next day. He had some kind of magnetism. I told my wife, he's either going to do a lot of good or he's going to end up like Hitler. With that said, I can see where some people could chalk it up to kids just being kids. But see, it was more than that. In his love of reading, there were specific people and subjects that he enjoyed reading about. What would those subjects be? Well, war was one of them. And prominent men that influenced history. Men such as Gandhi, Karl Marx, Stalin, and the most prominent of all, it was Hitler. He had a huge affinity for Hitler. He would assess every aspect of their lives, from their strengths to weaknesses, their accomplishments, their failures, their personalities, but most importantly, their power and how they got it. State that he didn't agree with the goals of Hitler, but that he was fascinated with the political structures and how some person got so much power over the people. Being such a bookworm, and particularly being so into this stuff, it really didn't help much in the friends category. Slowly, people, as they got older, stopped coming to the barn. And Jim Jones once again found himself alone. To no surprise, him and Don even drifted apart. See, Don ended up going more the athletics route, where Jim was more into the books, but it was definitely more than just one becoming an athlete and one becoming a nerd. There was one particular fight that sort of not completely ended the friendship, but definitely made it to where they really didn't talk to each other so much. But one day, Jim Jones was trying to speak the Bible to the other boys that were playing basketball, and basically, he got into Don's face and was trying to do the whole macho thing like they did when they were kids. But see, now Don was the stronger one because of Jim not wanting to do all the stuff that Don did. And Don ended up punching him square in the nose and knocked Jim to the ground. And Jim just stared on to Don dumbfounded. And Don walked away. After that, Jim was pretty much entirely a loner.